Welcome back to Tanya in 5. The last 2 days we've been studying chapter 10. Having established in chapter 9 the dynamics of the struggle between the godly soul and the animal soul, the godly soul starting in the heart, desiring that the entirety of the human experience be solely for the purpose of attaching to God, the animal soul beginning in the heart, wanting the entirety of the human experience to be self-motivated. Now, in chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13, the Alter Rebbe is going to describe for us varying degrees of success within that struggle. In chapter 10, the Tzaddik, the righteous one, who has full success, in which his entire life is dedicated to God. In chapter 11, the Rasha, the wicked one, who is still struggling to succeed. And then, in chapter 12 and 13, the Beinoni, which is essentially what we can expect the average person to succeed in the context of this struggle. As to our chapter 10, the Tzaddik, the Alter Rebbe explains that the Tzaddik, the righteous one, is not merely someone who does everything right and does everything for God, but much deeper than that is that Tzaddik's urges, his very desires and feelings themselves are directed to God. He does not need to control himself from doing a sin. He has no desire for sin. And within this, the Alter Rebbe defines 2 levels. The higher one is someone whose experience is so absorbed by the delight and joy of the truth of God that that is his only reality. His only reality is the delight and the truth of God himself. And therefore, everything he does is for nothing other than fulfilling God's purpose, because there is nothing else. And number 2, the very idea of doing something not for God is repulsive. He lives in such a world where the delight of God is so obvious that the idea of doing something that isn't for God is a repulsive notion. This is not to say that the Tzaddik does not have an animal soul. Even this high-level Tzaddik also has an animal soul which eats, sleeps, drinks, and goes to sleep. But unlike the average person who wakes up and says, I am hungry, I being the operative word and therefore selfish and non-godly, the Tzaddik says, God needs a healthy body to serve him, so I'll eat. As a natural instinct, that's the way he feels. Then there is the lower Tzaddik, who also has the natural instinct to only serve God. But his love of God is not defined by God being the delight of his life, but rather it's a feeling of intense desire to get close to God. And because of how intensely he feels this desire to get close to God, the idea of doing something not for God doesn't even occur to him. Notice the subtle distinction. For the higher level Tzaddik, because the only truth that he knows and the only truth that he lives in is the delight of God, therefore the notion of doing something not for God is repulsive. For the lower Tzaddik, it's not repulsive, it just doesn't occur to him. Because his desire to serve God is so intense and so overpowering that the idea of doing something not for God doesn't even occur to him. And therefore, all of the things he does is to fulfill this desire to get closer to God. Now, in thinking about the takeaway from this chapter, it's a bit challenging, because these 2 levels of Tzaddik are something that's not expected of the average individual, as we're going to learn in later chapters. So what could possibly be the takeaway from describing these 2 levels of a Tzaddik, one whose entire life is consumed by a desire to get closer to God, or another level of a Tzaddik, one whose life is consumed by the delight of God? How can that possibly be a lesson for us individuals who, wake up in the morning and say, I'm hungry? Now, the truth is that every Jew, even if they aren't a Tzaddik all the time, have moments when we feel like a Tzaddik. Every Jew has a moment when they feel even like the higher level of Tzaddik, where the only reality is God, and the notion of doing something not for God is repulsive, crazy, and out of the question. For one person, it's at the moment when the ark is opened at the end of Yom Kippur and we're screaming Shema Yisrael, and in that very moment, the Jew is so enraptured by the divine beauty of that moment, that the idea of doing something not for God is crazy. For another Jew, it's when they're sitting in the sukkah. For another Jew, it's when they're lighting menorah. Every Jew has these kind of moments. And the takeaway is two things. Number one, cherish these moments. Really cherish them. And number two, when you feel the urge to do, God forbid, a sin, remember how you felt during those moments. Looking forward to seeing you when we conclude chapter 11.